Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to another series of Voices for the Sociology of Media for 2023. Our special guest today is Eva Hussain and she is a Director, Relationships and Growth. Eva is a recognised leader in the fields of translations and European citizenship. She regularly presents at lectures, at conferences, universities and training institutions on the topic of language services, cultural awareness, and history. She is the founder of Polaron, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm sure I'll be
You
correcting
did.
that. And plays an active role in the global development of the company. Some of her previous roles included management operations of a telecommunications provider and administration over local government's age and disability department. Welcome, Eva, to our web podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Ricky, I am so pleased to be speaking with you today.
Thank you. Okay, Eva, tell us a little bit about yourself. What got you interested in languages?
What a good question. So look, I was born in Poland during the communist era, I guess, and languages is something you grow up with. In that, if you come from Europe, you very likely already speak 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 languages pretty much from birth. But it's also built in, and it's always been quite built in into the educational system. So I guess you just learn languages at school as you go along. However, English wasn't one of them. So when I came to Australia as a refugee in 1986, I did not speak a word of English. I think hello maybe was just about the only word I knew. So as you can imagine, learning, the systems and everything else that comes with immigrating as a refugee, I guess, was extra hard because I did not speak English that well. I've improved since, as you hopefully can hear, but I do have an accent, and sometimes I get asked about it, and people can rarely pick that it's Polish, and I always get asked about my surname. And that confuses people. So I use it as my party trick, and I give people a hard time, and I ask them where I come from. But now that I've told you that I'm from Poland, we can't use that, right, Ricky?
That's true. Now, I'm really excited because one, we have a lot of common interests we were talking about before and a bit of our backgrounds. I want to ask you, coming in Australia in 1986 and being a refugee, what was the stigma like that you experienced with that label of refugee in that era that you can remember?
Yeah, another excellent question, because the answer is I didn't. I think it's a matter of you don't know what you don't know. And I guess when there's so many other things to worry about, like, basic stuff like food and, education and all of that, you don't actually see discrimination. It's not so visible, or you just have other things to worry about. So I was 18 months pregnant when I came here. My son's now 36, or he's going to be 37 this year. So, I was in a violent relationship, and all of that kind of overtook how I felt in Australia, I guess, because there was urgency to other things, if you like. But I felt welcome here, and it's only now that I can kind of realize that some of it is pretty superficial. Like, I'm very grateful to Australia, but I have a problem with this grateful migrant persona that we sometimes need to apply. Having said that, I think it is a welcoming place, and I've achieved what I've achieved, family-wise, professionally, thanks to other Australians, also thanks to my hard work and all of that. But I do think that I see things a little bit differently now, and some things haven't changed since I've come here.
And what was your experience like of the education system in Australia?
So I have a really good story about that, Ricky, because I missed out on education. I didn't even finish high school in Poland. I left just before the sort of final exam. So when I arrived, I knew that it is something that I wanted to continue. But of course, as a poor migrant, a poor refugee, the first thing you've got to do is get a job, which I did. And I hated being on welfare. I was a few weeks, I think, receiving like it used to be called single mother's benefit or something like that, and I absolutely hated it. So when I got my job, it was in Maya in the city, and like my family thought, oh my, she's the best thing ever. But
Mm.
I had this desire to go back to school, and I lived in St Kilda at the time, where in the local newspaper they were advertising Skillshare. So both you and I of the vintage that we know what that means, but if people
Yes.
don't, yeah, it's just a pathway to, like, it was a school to teach you typewriting,
Yes.
computers, a little bit of office stuff and stuff. Yeah. So I quit my job because week after week after week, I saw this thing advertised in the local paper. So I thought, if they're advertising, they must have places. So guess what? I turned up for the interview and they're like, oh my God, what have you done? There's a waiting list. And that was my first taste of not understanding Australia. So this was, I think it was about 2 years after I've been here, because I was just so distressed at what you see is not what you get here. Like, that was so confusing for me. But I ended up doing the course, and then I studied computer programming at college, and kind of, I'm here to tell the story. But I think for some people that come from outside of Australia, the education system is quite confusing here.
Mm. And I'm just thinking of that big step you took in giving up paid employment. And I'm just
Mm,
thinking about like the people you've worked with over the years in your role. And that's sometimes we don't hear that in the media. We just
mm.
we always hear the story of you take, but even as a migrant, you coming in as that difficult choice you had to make from having, and my era, like Myers was prestigious. Like in 1980, in the early 80s, I dreamed of wanting to work in Myer because that was seen as a status symbol. It was
You've
seen,
made it.
you've made it,
Yeah.
because I grew up in the western suburbs. So for me, it was the store to be if you wanted to be somebody.
Yes.
All about prestige. And if you were poor, you worked in a space where wealthy people would come. You would almost be part of that kind of illusion, I guess, if you want to call it, or
Yes.
part of that. You're walking into this world of privilege and you're
Yeah.
part,
Upper class.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Really
for,
fancy.
and for many people who don't have much, who came to Australia, they saw that, oh my God, you've made it. It's like going
Yeah.
to Buckingham Palace. That's sort of.
Yes. Yeah. 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 You're absolutely right. So therefore, the decision to stop working there and return to school, by my family at least, they thought I'm gonna be mad. So, but I knew that I would always be at a disadvantage if I didn't get education behind me.
So you went into the computer programming. How did you transgress then? Like, what got you to where you are now?
Okay, so one of the things I'll just say, that computer programming, I chose it. I can't even tell you why now, because I thought, okay, well, maybe that's where progress is, or maybe that's where, that's the word of the future, world of the future, or something like that. So then for a few years, I worked in that space, and I ended up going overseas for a couple of years. And then when I returned, I worked for the local government. And
Mm.
that was a really interesting experience, because it was another dream job of mine. Like, I thought I can make a real difference. But what I discovered, and I'm Polish, I'm very cynical. I'm sorry, Ricky and listeners, but I just saw through what was happening there, and I came away with that disappointment. And I thought, okay, never again will I let anybody tell me what to do. So I set up my own company. This is now 23 years ago, and I probably couldn't work with or for anybody else. So, running your own business is a lot of fun, but it's of course stressful, and particularly as you grow, you need to remain agile and relevant, and you have taxes to pay, and people to hire and fire and all of that. So it's a very different space, but at least the way that I feel is that I make my own future. I'm not dependent on anyone say so.
Mm. And I'm just sort of, before we go into the idea, to the work that you do in translations, I'm just, for people listening, especially for people researching the area of gender and business, when you started your business, what did you feel that your gender was an issue in terms of your expectations of what people thought,
Hmm.
or what is she doing, could
Yeah.
she, or
You, Ricky, I think I might be walking around with blinkers on because I'm so focused, I guess, and I don't see it. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But I just thought that I can do anything. I'm fearless, and and it's also because I was brought up in a family where women ruled. So my grandmother was a school principal, my mother was a teacher. They've always worked, and I had these role models where, this is one surprising thing actually that I found in Australia when I arrived here, how backwards things were when it came to sort of gender equality. Because whatever you can say about communies, we had to be equal. We had to roll up sleeves and work and all of that. So I kind of that was a bit of a culture shock when I could, women that fell pregnant would quit work because nobody would employ them, and there was no, and until today there's no provision for things like maternity leave. Not really, right?
mm,
So for me, it was never about gender, but the one thing that I don't have that other people born here have is networks. So coming at the
right,
age of 18, you have to build them, and it's not like I can bump into a school friend here. It's not like I can use university networks because I've missed out on all of that. So that's the hard bit, I think.
mm. And tell us a little bit about your business.
Sorry, Ricky, I've just left there for a minute. Could you say that again?
So tell us a little bit about your business, what you
What
do.
I do? Thank you. So I started as a translator and interpreter in the Polish language pairs, and when I did, and this is now 23 years ago, there was a lot of demand for that language. The Polish community in Australia was top 10, let's say, still. And there was a lot of demand in aged care, in courts, in mental health, in health generally speaking. So I could work 24/7.
Mm,
But after about 2 years, I realized that I can contribute a bit more to society, I guess. So we started doing other languages, and the company kind of grew organically. But in 2000, I remember the nerves of ordering business cards. I was like, oh my God, it's $35. Will I ever be able to make it? So that all that trepidation and kind of exciting anxiety, if I can put it that way, and not knowing where it's going to go. I still remember that, and I respect that feeling because I think running a business is not easy. We now employ, I think, about 50 staff, so that's grown really massively. But I never sat down back then and thought, this is what's going to happen. It was just never in my wildest dream did I ever think it'll grow to this extent.
mm. And I think this is the importance, and a lot of us know who are in the research space, when we do research, we tend to, I guess, sometimes look for constructing our research to interview those who are using interviewing of participants. But I always think to myself, there is always a missed opportunity, a rich tapestry of people who perhaps English is not it's their first language, might be the second, third, fourth, or
Mm.
have you seen a change or a growth in translation services over the years that you've been running your business?
Yeah. Yes and no, Ricky. And can I just say that research is something that I'm interested in from one angle, and that is that when we research, we often exclude probably about 50% of our population.
Yes.
Because I think research, and I'm not a researcher, so forgive me if I'm going to be direct, but I think research is a very wide space.
Image, yeah.
In that, yeah, in that we don't think, for example, some COVID research as an example. One of the reasons that there are so many disadvantaged pockets of communities is because they weren't taken into account when we looked at how we communicate COVID, how we research COVID.
And I think researchers know this, and there are ethical approvals into which these things aren't built. So that's what I'm seeing as a bystander. And I can tell you that any efforts at including diverse communities are sort of tokenistic from what I'm seeing. So I have been a little bit critical of that, because I think if we are to cater for everybody, we need to think of these linguistic and cultural considerations and how to involve everyone in research, because it is then only the way to get a true picture of an issue or something that you're researching. And look, translations have grown, and they have also decreased in a way. And what I mean by that is that people will ask about technology, and we use technology to support us nowadays. But I think in Australia, we waste a lot of money on translations, where we do translations of things that people will never read, or for communities that do not have required literacy to understand translations. So maybe there's not even a script in the language. So I think sometimes we throw money at the problems instead of thinking of, okay, how do we tailor-make communication for certain communities? That's what I would be advocating. So I think, Australian government and Victorian government and New South Wales government are the biggest purchasers of language services. But whether there's waste or whether that money is being used wisely, I would question that.
I'm very fascinated, and thank you for that insight that we're all hearing you speak, because I think we need to realize sometimes when we're constructing our samples that we have to consider, could we use an interpreter service somehow?
Yes.
Incorporate more voices.
Yes.
To not always rely on, a sample that's easy for the researcher to, I mean, easy as in it's done. We need to consider the value of having people who can contribute through an interpret from their lens, from how they see the barriers. And as you're saying that, we need to really look more deeper and not in being superficial. The other area I was interested in our series with media is looking at digital technologies. And you mentioned that I do have one of the things that I was a bit worried when I was seeing on television and on the internet, all these little apps now that they call.
Yes.
And how has that impacted your professional translation services when you see that people say, like, learn a language in 5 minutes?
Yes. Yes.
Maybe debunk some of this, or just I'd love to hear your input into this.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking that, Ricky. And look, I think if you want to get the gist of something, those kinds of apps are great. You're traveling in Japan and you want to get directions, fantastic. It's probably going to be, you might have a few laughs, but it's probably going to be accurate. But if you're going to produce something that's for publication or for people to make informed choices or consent or any of those things that are important and that affect people's lives, you really need to rely on human translators. I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon. I hope not, because I think, the question for me is, yes, we can, but should we? Like we can all live through apps and never go out and, rely on, robots, let's put it that way. But I think it takes away, that human aspect and that organic community aspect from us. But apart from that, machine translation isn't accurate. It doesn't. It's an engine. So as you, as a researcher, will know that it actually compares bits of text that people have translated previously, and it doesn't understand humor. It doesn't understand the human interaction, or it's not intelligent. And from that aspect, I think human translators are here to stay. But there's room for technology, and there's room for apps that can translate for you. When it comes to learning a language in 5 minutes, I wish we could, but we know that we can't. So you have to put a bit more work in it. But I think the other thing I'll just mention is that Australia, we don't really value languages, yet we speak 300 languages here. including indigenous languages. So we could be like an amazing hub of language support for the rest of the world, but we don't study languages as kids, you know, like we might study French and forget, you know, whatever we've learned, and you know, the value of bilingualism isn't really promoted here enough yet. Yeah.
And we have a lot of young people listening to our web podcast, especially high school students, and they're thinking of careers. What would you advice be for, say, someone who's listening who would love to perhaps be an interpreter? Do you see that as a worthwhile career to pursue?
Again, excellent question. I think what I'll say about this is this, that there are lots of associated careers. For example, you could work as a project manager, you could work as a subtitler, you could maybe even potentially work you know, in the tech space where apps are being developed. In addition to, depending on the language pairs, of being able to work as an interpreter or translator. So I think sometimes people have this romantic idea of what translation is going to look like. So let me tell you that if you're thinking of sitting in a cafe in Paris and translating books, that's not going to happen. So I think it's still a very worthwhile and amazing career, particularly in Europe, where you know, being an interpreter or translator is probably better than working at Maya, Ricky. It's quite a high level, fancy, you know, profession. Here in Australia, a lot of us work in the community, and there's space depending on the language. But if you choose, like, I don't know, French or German, probably not many opportunities. If you work with Arabic or Chinese, probably a lot. So you need to consider whether, you know, studying is in your language pair is the way to go if you want to have a sustainable career.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Eva, for spending some time with us. Now, we put your company details below. So if anyone's interested in any research space to talk to you, they can reach out to you, can they? And you're available for consultations?
For anything at all. I love, as you can tell, talking about languages, talking about my profession. It is a passion. So any questions or anything else anybody wants to know, feel free to reach out, Ricky. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And thank you for spending some time with Voices.
Thank you.